Lord Edmund Blackwood stood at the grand window of Ravenshollow Castle, watching the morning mist roll across the emerald fields of his vast estate. At 45, he carried himself with the dignity expected of one born into the highest echelons of nobility. Yet there was a restlessness in his dark eyes that spoke of a man questioning the very foundations of his existence. For nearly 2 decades, Lady Margaret Thornfield had been the center of his world. Their relationship had weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser bonds, scandals whispered in drawing rooms, family disapproval, and the weight of societal expectations that demanded he marry someone deemed more suitable for his station. Margaret, with her auburn hair and fierce intelligence, had been his confidant, his passion, and his rebellion against the rigid structures of aristocratic life. But as Edmund gazed across his domain this particular morning, he found his thoughts drifting not to Margaret, but to a young woman who had recently arrived at court. Lady Isabella Fairfax possessed a grace that seemed to illuminate every room she entered. At 28, she was everything that society demanded in a noblewoman: beautiful, educated, and blessed with an innate understanding of diplomatic nuances that made her invaluable during state functions. Isabella had caught his attention during the harvest festival 3 months prior. While other ladies focused on gossiping behind their fans, she had been genuinely interested in the concerns of the tenant farmers, asking thoughtful questions about crop rotation and rural education. Her compassion was neither performed nor calculated. It flowed from her naturally, like water from a spring. The contrast between the two women had become increasingly stark in Edmund's mind. Margaret represented his past, passionate but complicated, demanding but rewarding. She understood the weight of power and responsibility, having been raised in similar circumstances. Their conversations could span hours, dissecting political strategies and philosophical questions that few others in their circle could comprehend. Isabella, however, represented something entirely different. She embodied hope and renewal, bringing fresh perspectives to age-old problems. When she spoke about establishing schools in rural villages or improving conditions for working families, her eyes sparkled with genuine enthusiasm. She made Edmund remember why he had once believed that nobility came with the responsibility to serve others, not merely to preserve privilege. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the castle's ancient stones. Edmund's butler Davies appeared silently at his side, a trait perfected over 30 years of service. "The morning correspondence, your lordship," Davies announced, presenting a silver tray laden with letters sealed in various colors of wax. Edmund's fingers immediately found the letter bearing Margaret's distinctive crimson seal. Her handwriting, bold and confident, filled 3 pages with updates from the capital, political gossip, and plans for their upcoming weekend together. Yet as he read her familiar words, Edmund felt an unexpected distance, as though viewing their relationship through glass rather than living within it. The second letter that drew his attention bore the Fairfax family crest. Isabella's handwriting was more delicate than Margaret's, but no less purposeful. She wrote to thank him for his support of her rural education initiative and to request a meeting to discuss implementation strategies. Her words were formal and appropriate, yet Edmund detected warmth beneath the proper language. "Davies," Edmund said, folding both letters carefully, "please arrange for my carriage this afternoon. I believe I shall pay a visit to Fairfax Manor." The elderly butler's expression remained neutral, but Edmund caught the slightest raise of an eyebrow. Davies had served the Blackwood family long enough to recognize the subtle shifts that preceded major changes. The journey to Fairfax Manor took Edmund through countryside that seemed particularly vibrant that day. Autumn had painted the landscape in brilliant oranges and golds, and the crisp air carried the scent of wood smoke from cottage chimneys. As his carriage wheels rolled along the cobblestone path, Edmund found himself anticipating Isabella's reaction to his unexpected visit. Fairfax Manor, while smaller than Ravenshollow Castle, possessed an elegance that spoke of refined taste rather than ostentatious display. The gardens were meticulously maintained, with late-blooming roses creating splashes of color against carefully trimmed hedges. Isabella received him in the morning room, where afternoon light streamed through tall windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. "Lord Blackwood," she said, rising gracefully from her writing desk. "What an unexpected pleasure." Edmund found himself studying her face more intently than propriety strictly allowed. Isabella's beauty was not the dramatic kind that commanded immediate attention, but rather a subtle loveliness that revealed itself gradually, like dawn breaking over distant mountains. Her dark hair was arranged simply, and her dress, while fashionable, avoided the elaborate ornamentation favored by many ladies of her station. "Lady Isabella, I hope you will forgive the intrusion. Your letter regarding the rural education project arrived this morning, and I found myself eager to discuss the details." They spent the next 2 hours reviewing plans, examining maps, and debating implementation strategies. Edmund discovered that Isabella's knowledge extended far beyond theory. She had spent considerable time visiting rural communities, understanding their specific needs and challenges. Her approach was practical and compassionate, focused on sustainable solutions rather than temporary charity. As the afternoon light began to fade, Edmund realized he had been completely absorbed in their conversation. The easy flow of ideas, Isabella's genuine laughter at his occasional witticisms, and her thoughtful responses to complex questions created an atmosphere of intellectual and emotional connection that he had not experienced in years. When he finally prepared to leave, Isabella walked with him to the front entrance. The evening air carried the first hint of approaching winter, and Edmund noticed her slight shiver. "Lady Isabella," he said, pausing at his carriage door, "I hope we might continue this conversation soon. Perhaps you would consider joining me for dinner at Ravenshollow this Saturday." The invitation hung between them, carrying implications that both understood but neither acknowledged openly. Isabella's hesitation lasted only a moment before she smiled. "I would be delighted." Lord Blackwood, as his carriage pulled away from Fairfax Manor, Edmund felt a stirring in his chest that he had not experienced in many years, the excitement of new possibilities, combined with the bittersweet recognition that his life was about to change in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. The Saturday dinner at Ravenshollow Castle proved to be a revelation that would echo through the corridors of both Edmund's heart and the broader aristocratic community. Isabella arrived precisely at the appointed hour, wearing a gown of midnight, blue silk that complemented her eyes and spoke of understated elegance rather than ostentatious display. Edmund had instructed his staff to prepare the smaller dining room rather than the grand hall, creating an atmosphere more conducive to intimate conversation. Candlelight flickered against the ancient tapestries that adorned the walls, and a fire crackled warmly in the massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the centuries-old oak table. "Your home is magnificent," Isabella said as Edmund guided her through the portrait gallery toward the dining room. "These paintings tell such stories." She paused before a portrait of Edmund's great-grandfather, studying the strong jawline and determined eyes that had been passed down through generations of Blackwood men. "He established the first school in our village," Edmund explained, standing closer to Isabella than strict propriety demanded. "I remember my father telling me stories of how he would personally visit every family to ensure their children were attending classes." "Education as a family tradition," Isabella observed with approval. "How wonderful that you continue that legacy." Their dinner conversation flowed effortlessly from practical matters of estate management to deeper philosophical questions about duty, privilege, and social responsibility. Isabella shared stories from her travels to various rural communities, painting vivid pictures of families struggling to balance tradition with progress. Edmund found himself captivated not only by her words but by the passionate way she spoke about creating positive change. "I believe," Isabella said, setting down her wineglass thoughtfully, "that true nobility lies not in blood or title, but in service to others. Those born to privilege have an obligation to lift up those who are not." Her words struck Edmund powerfully. These were principles he had once embraced wholeheartedly, but had allowed to fade under the weight of political pressures and social expectations. Margaret, while intellectually brilliant, had always approached such matters from a strategic perspective, calculating political advantages rather than pursuing genuine humanitarian goals. As the evening progressed, Edmund became increasingly aware of the stark differences between his two relationships. With Margaret, conversations often centered on power dynamics, social maneuvering, and maintaining their position within the complex hierarchy of the nobility. With Isabella, he found himself discussing dreams, possibilities, and the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. "Tell me about your rural education initiative," Edmund said as they moved to the library for brandy and continued conversation. "What specific changes do you envision?" Isabella's eyes lit up as she described her comprehensive plan. She envisioned not just basic literacy and numeracy, but practical skills training that would help rural families improve their livelihoods. Her approach included training local teachers, establishing traveling libraries, and creating apprenticeship programs that would connect young people with skilled craftsmen. "The key," she explained, accepting a small glass of brandy, "is sustainability. Too many charitable efforts fail because they impose solutions from the outside rather than building capacity within communities." Edmund found himself leaning forward, genuinely excited by her vision. "I have several properties that could serve as pilot locations. The tenants on my Yorkshire estate have been asking for better educational opportunities for their children. Would you truly be willing to invest in such a project?" Isabella asked, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "With you leading the effort, I believe we could create something truly transformative," Edmund replied, then paused, realizing the weight of his words. They had moved beyond discussing a charitable project. They were talking about a partnership that would require sustained collaboration and shared commitment. The implications hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11 o'clock, and Isabella glanced toward the window where moonlight painted silver patterns on the glass. "I should return home," she said reluctantly. "Thank you for a wonderful evening, Lord Blackwood. I cannot remember when I have enjoyed such stimulating conversation." As Edmund escorted her to the waiting carriage, their fingers brushed briefly when he helped her with her cloak. The simple contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, a reminder of possibilities that extended far beyond intellectual compatibility. "Lady Isabella," he said as they reached the carriage door, "I wonder if you might consider joining me for a ride through the Yorkshire properties next week. I would value your assessment of their potential for our educational project." Isabella hesitated for just a moment, and Edmund realized she understood that such an excursion would represent a significant step forward in their relationship. A day spent traveling together, away from the watchful eyes of society, would inevitably lead to deeper intimacy and more serious questions about their future. "I would be honored," she replied finally, her voice soft but certain. As the carriage disappeared into the night, Edmund stood in the courtyard longer than necessary, breathing the crisp autumn air and contemplating the evening's revelations. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely excited about the future, rather than merely resigned to it. Inside the castle, he made his way to his private study and settled into the leather chair behind his massive desk. A letter from Margaret lay unopened among the day's correspondence, its crimson seal a stark reminder of obligations and relationships that suddenly felt complicated in ways they never had before. He broke the seal and read Margaret's familiar handwriting detailing social events, political gossip, and plans for their upcoming engagement. Her words, while affectionate, felt strangely distant, as though they belonged to a life he was gradually leaving behind. Edmund set the letter aside and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. He began drafting a response to Isabella, outlining potential dates for their Yorkshire excursion and describing specific properties that might serve their educational goals. As he wrote, he found himself imagining their future collaboration, the satisfaction of creating lasting change, and the possibility of building something meaningful together. The candle burned low as Edmund continued writing, his words flowing with an enthusiasm he had not felt in years. Outside, autumn wind rustled through the ancient oak trees that surrounded Raven's Hollow Castle, carrying with it the promise of change and new beginnings that even the most carefully constructed traditions could not resist. When he finally set down his pen, Edmund realized he had written not just a business letter, but a document that revealed the stirring of emotions he had thought buried beneath years of duty and compromise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Edmund Blackwood felt truly alive. The Yorkshire journey took place on a crisp October morning when the countryside displayed autumn's full glory. Edmund had arranged for a comfortable traveling coach, well appointed with warm blankets and refreshments, understanding that the day would require several hours of travel to visit the various properties he had in mind for Isabella's educational initiative. Isabella arrived at Ravens Hollow Castle dressed practically for country travel, wearing a deep green riding habit that complemented her natural beauty, while remaining appropriate for their professional purpose. Edmund found himself appreciating her practical approach to the day ahead, so different from Margaret's tendency to treat every outing as a social performance requiring elaborate preparation. Their first stop was Moorfield Village, a farming community nestled in a valley where Edmund owned substantial acreage. The village consisted of perhaps 40 families, mostly tenant farmers who had worked the land for generations. The current schoolhouse was little more than a converted barn, with one elderly teacher attempting to educate children ranging from age 5 to 14. The challenge is obvious, Isabella observed as they toured the inadequate facility. Multiple age groups, insufficient materials, and no curriculum designed for rural needs. Edmund watched as she knelt to speak with several young children, asking about their interests and dreams. Her genuine warmth drew them out of their initial shyness, and soon they were chattering excitedly about their daily lives and aspirations. "This young man wants to learn about crop science," Isabella told Edmund, indicating a bright-eyed boy of perhaps 12. "And this girl has expressed interest in learning to keep accounts for her family's small dairy operation." "Practical skills that would benefit their entire community," Edmund agreed, feeling increasingly excited about the project's potential. They spent the morning meeting with local families, understanding their specific needs and challenges. Isabella took careful notes, asking thoughtful questions about seasonal work patterns, family responsibilities, and educational priorities. Edmund found himself watching her interact with people from all walks of life, noting how she treated each person with genuine respect and interest regardless of their social station. During their midday meal at a local inn, they discussed implementation strategies in detail. Isabella had developed a comprehensive plan that would address not only basic education, but also practical skills training, health education, and community development initiatives. "The key is starting small and building success gradually," she explained, spreading her notes across the wooden table. "If we can demonstrate positive results in 1 or 2 villages, other communities will request similar programs. I have properties in 5 different counties," Edmund said, leaning closer to study her plans. "We could create a network of model schools that share resources and teaching methods." As they talked, Edmund became increasingly aware of Isabella's proximity. The way afternoon sunlight highlighted the gold threads in her dark hair, and the genuine passion that animated her features when she discussed her vision for social improvement. He realized that what had begun as intellectual attraction was deepening into something far more profound. Their second stop was Millbrook, a larger village with more established infrastructure, but also more entrenched resistance to change. The local rector, Father Morrison, had been educating village children in traditional subjects but showed little enthusiasm for Isabella's proposed innovations. "Young lady," Father Morrison said with barely concealed condescension, "rural children need to learn their letters and basic scripture. These fancy ideas about practical training and scientific agriculture are unnecessary complications." Edmund watched Isabella's response carefully, noting how she maintained her composure despite the rector's dismissive tone. "Father Morrison," she replied respectfully, "I completely agree that literacy and moral education are fundamental. However, I believe we can enhance rather than replace traditional instruction. Teaching children to read using materials about agriculture or commerce makes learning more relevant to their daily lives." The debate continued for nearly an hour, with Isabella patiently addressing each objection while demonstrating deep knowledge of educational theory and practical implementation. Edmund found himself impressed not only by her expertise, but by her diplomatic skills in handling resistance without compromising her vision. As they prepared to leave Millbrook, Edmund realized they had been traveling together for nearly 8 hours, yet conversation had never flagged. Their intellectual compatibility seemed limitless, covering topics from educational philosophy to agricultural innovation to social reform. More importantly, he felt comfortable sharing thoughts and ideas with Isabella that he had never expressed to anyone else. "I must confess something," Edmund said as their carriage rolled through the gathering dusk toward Ravens Hollow Castle. "Today has been one of the most satisfying days I have experienced in years. Your vision for these communities is inspiring, Isabella turned toward him in the lamplight, and Edmund saw something in her expression that made his heart race. The professional distance they had maintained throughout the day seemed to dissolve in the intimate confines of the coach. "Lord Blackwood," she said softly, "I must tell you that your support means more to me than you might realize. So few people of your position are willing to invest in genuine social change." "Edmund," he corrected gently. "Given our collaboration, I hope you will use my given name." "Edmund," she repeated, and the sound of his name on her lips sent warmth spreading through his chest. They rode in comfortable silence for several miles, each lost in contemplation of the day's experiences and their implications. Edmund found himself studying Isabella's profile in the flickering carriage lamp, noting the determined set of her chin and the thoughtful expression that suggested she too was processing new feelings and possibilities. When they arrived at Ravenshollow Castle, Edmund helped Isabella from the carriage, their hands lingering in contact longer than necessity required. The physical attraction that had been building throughout the day was now undeniable, adding new complexity to their developing relationship. "Isabella," Edmund said as they stood in the courtyard, "I hope you know that this partnership we are discussing extends beyond charitable work. Your presence in my life has awakened possibilities I had not dared to imagine." Isabella looked up at him, moonlight reflecting in her eyes, and Edmund saw her own internal struggle between propriety and genuine feeling. "I feel it too," she admitted quietly. "But we must be careful, Edmund. Such connections have consequences that extend far beyond our personal happiness." Her words carried the weight of unspoken understanding. Both knew that Edmund's long-standing relationship with Margaret Thornfield made any romantic involvement with Isabella potentially scandalous. Yet the connection between them had grown too strong to ignore or dismiss as mere infatuation. "I understand the complications," Edmund replied, "but I cannot pretend that today meant nothing. Something has changed between us, and I find myself unwilling to ignore it." Isabella nodded slowly, her expression mixing hope with apprehension. "Then we must consider our next steps very carefully. There are others whose feelings and futures must be taken into account." As her carriage prepared to carry her home, Edmund knew that their relationship had crossed an invisible line from professional collaboration to something far more personal and dangerous. The mention of others hung between them, a clear reference to Margaret and the difficult conversations that lay ahead. Margaret Thornfield's arrival at Ravenshollow Castle 3 weeks later came without advance notice, her carriage thundering up the cobblestone drive with an urgency that immediately alerted the household staff to trouble brewing. Edmund heard the commotion from his study, where he had been reviewing architectural plans for the new school buildings he and Isabella had designed for the Yorkshire properties. "My lord," Davies announced with his characteristic calm despite the obvious tension in the air, "Lady Margaret has arrived and requests immediate audience." Edmund set aside the plans, his stomach tightening with apprehension. Margaret's unexpected visits were rare and usually signaled significant political developments or personal crises. Given his recent preoccupation with Isabella and their educational project, he suspected this visit concerned more personal matters. Margaret swept into the study without waiting for proper announcement, her emerald traveling dress wrinkled from hours in the carriage and her usually perfect auburn hair showing signs of hasty departure. Most telling, however, were her eyes, blazing with an intensity that Edmund recognized as barely controlled fury. "Edmund," she said, dispensing with customary greetings, "we need to discuss certain developments that have come to my attention. Margaret, what brings you here so urgently? You look as though you have been traveling through the night." "Indeed I have," she replied sharply, settling into the chair across from his desk with the predatory grace of a woman preparing for battle. "I received some very interesting correspondence yesterday from Lady Pemberton, who happened to be visiting her properties in Yorkshire last week." Edmund felt his blood chill. Lady Pemberton was notorious throughout aristocratic circles for her keen observation skills and her tendency to share gossip with devastating precision. If she had witnessed his day with Isabella, the news would spread through society like wildfire. "Lady Pemberton mentioned seeing you touring rural villages with Lady Isabella Fairfax," Margaret continued, her voice deceptively casual. "She described your interaction as remarkably intimate for what was supposedly a charitable inspection." "Isabella and I are collaborating on an educational initiative," Edmund replied, attempting to maintain neutral tone while internally cursing Lady Pemberton's timing. The project requires site visits and planning meetings. Margaret's laugh was sharp and humorless. Oh, Edmund, please do not insult my intelligence. Lady Pemberton is many things, but she is not blind. She described the way you looked at Miss Fairfax, the careful attention you paid to her comfort, and the obvious familiarity between you. Standing abruptly, Margaret began pacing the study with predatory restlessness. Edmund had seen this behavior before during their most serious arguments, and he recognized the signs of a woman fighting for something she considered vital to her survival. For 20 years, Edmund, I have been patient with your noble ideals and your occasional romantic wanderings. I understood that men of your position sometimes require distractions. But this situation with Lady Isabella appears to be something entirely different. Margaret, you are overreacting to gossip and speculation. Am I? She spun to face him directly, her eyes blazing. Then explain why your letters have become increasingly distant over the past month. Explain why you have canceled our last 3 planned meetings. Explain why you spend hours writing correspondence that you carefully conceal when I visit. Edmund realized that Margaret's accusations were more accurate than he had anticipated. Without conscious decision, he had indeed been withdrawing from their relationship, finding excuses to avoid their usual meetings and social commitments. His growing feelings for Isabella had made continued intimacy with Margaret feel increasingly inappropriate. I have been preoccupied with estate business and the educational project, he said weakly, knowing the excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. Margaret stopped pacing and studied his face with the analytical skills that had made her such a formidable political ally over the years. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of genuine pain beneath the anger. Edmund, I know you better than anyone else in this world. I can see in your eyes that something fundamental has changed. This is not about estate business or charitable work. This is about Lady Isabella Fairfax and the effect she has had on your heart. The accuracy of her observation hit Edmund like a physical blow. Margaret's ability to read his emotions had always been both blessing and curse in their relationship. She could provide comfort and understanding during his darkest moments, but she could also expose truths he was not ready to confront. You are asking me to deny my own observations and feelings, he replied carefully. I will not lie to you, Margaret. My association with Isabella has been enlightening. She brings perspectives and energies that I find refreshing. Refreshing, Margaret repeated bitterly. Is that what we are calling it now? And what of our relationship, Edmund? What of the years we have invested in each other? What of the promises we have made? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with 20 years of shared history, passion, and mutual support. Edmund found himself struggling to articulate feelings that he did not fully understand himself. I cannot pretend that nothing has changed, he said finally. Isabella has awakened something in me that I thought was lost forever. She represents possibilities that I had stopped believing in. Margaret's face went pale, and for a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the vulnerable woman beneath the sophisticated exterior. And what am I, Edmund? What do I represent? Am I simply the comfortable past that you are now ready to discard for a younger, fresher alternative? You know it is not that simple, Margaret. You represent shared history, intellectual partnership, and deep connection, but Isabella represents renewal, hope, and the possibility of creating something meaningful together. Creating something meaningful, Margaret said with bitter emphasis. Are you telling me that our relationship has been meaningless? That 20 years of love, support, and partnership count for nothing against a few weeks of infatuation with a young idealist? Edmund stood and moved to the window, needing distance from Margaret's penetrating gaze while he struggled to organize his thoughts. The autumn landscape outside seemed to mock the turmoil in his heart with its peaceful beauty. I am telling you that I am questioning everything I thought I knew about love, duty, and happiness. Isabella has shown me a version of myself that I had forgotten existed. Someone who believes in possibility, rather than merely accepting limitation. Margaret joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell her familiar perfume and sense the tension radiating from her body. Edmund, she said softly, I understand the appeal of new romance, but consider carefully what you are risking. We have built something real and lasting together. We understand each other's complexities and accept each other's flaws. That kind of mature love is rare and precious. Her words carried weight because they contained undeniable truth. Margaret knew him completely, accepted his weaknesses as well as his strengths, and had stood by him through political controversies and personal struggles that would have driven away a less committed partner. "I am not making any hasty decisions," Edmund replied. "But I cannot ignore what is happening in my heart." Margaret nodded slowly, her expression mixing sadness with grim determination. "Then you must choose, Edmund. You cannot continue this emotional journey with Lady Isabella while maintaining our relationship. It is unfair to all parties involved, and it will ultimately destroy any possibility of happiness for any of us." Her ultimatum, delivered with quiet dignity, forced Edmund to confront the reality he had been avoiding. The comfortable ambiguity of recent weeks could not continue indefinitely. Soon, very soon, he would need to make decisions that would irrevocably change the course of multiple lives. The week following Margaret's confrontation passed in agonizing deliberation for Edmund. He found himself unable to concentrate on routine estate business, spending long hours walking the castle grounds and wrestling with a decision that would reshape the lives of everyone involved. The autumn air carried the first hint of approaching winter, and the shorter days seemed to mirror the darkness of his internal struggle. Isabella's letter arrived on Thursday morning, written in her elegant hand and containing updates on their educational project, along with an invitation to review the final architectural plans at Fairfax Manor. Reading her words, Edmund felt the familiar stirring of excitement and hope that had become associated with her presence in his life. Yet Margaret's ultimatum echoed in his mind, demanding resolution. That afternoon, Edmund made the journey to Fairfax Manor with the weight of decision heavy on his shoulders. He had spent the previous night writing and discarding multiple drafts of letters to both women, searching for words that could adequately express the complexity of his situation. In the end, he had decided that honest conversation was the only path forward. Isabella received him in her garden, where late-blooming roses provided splashes of color against the approaching gray of winter. She wore a simple day dress of soft blue wool, and Edmund noticed that she seemed more subdued than usual, as though she too sensed that their relationship had reached a crucial juncture. "Edmund," she said, leading him to a stone bench beneath an ancient oak tree, "I confess I have been thinking a great deal about our last conversation and its implications." "As have I," he replied, settling beside her and noting how natural it felt to be in her presence despite the gravity of their situation. "In fact, I have something important to discuss with you." Isabella turned to face him fully, her expression mixing anticipation with apprehension. "I suspect we are both aware that our friendship has evolved beyond the bounds of propriety or simple collaboration." "Indeed," Edmund agreed, appreciating her directness. "And that evolution has created complications that can no longer be ignored or postponed." For several moments, they sat in comfortable silence, watching autumn leaves drift down from the oak branches above them. Edmund found himself storing these details in memory. The way afternoon light caught the gold threads in Isabella's hair, the soft sound of her breathing, the peaceful atmosphere that surrounded them despite the turmoil in his heart. "Margaret visited me last week," he said finally. "She has become aware of our association and demands that I choose between continuing our relationship and pursuing whatever is developing between us." Isabella's expression grew serious, and Edmund saw her hands tighten slightly in her lap. "I suspected this conversation was inevitable. Lady Margaret has invested 20 years in your relationship. She would not surrender that investment without a fight. The situation is more complex than simple rivalry," Edmund continued. "Margaret and I share history, political alliance, and deep understanding. What we have built together has sustained us both through difficult times. Yet you find yourself questioning whether shared history is sufficient foundation for continued happiness," Isabella finished softly. Edmund nodded, grateful for her intuitive understanding. "You have awakened something in me that I thought was permanently buried. A sense of possibility, of hope for the future, of belief that individual actions can create meaningful change." Isabella stood and walked a few steps away, her back turned as she gathered her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of careful consideration. "Edmund, I must be honest with you. I have developed feelings that extend far beyond professional collaboration or casual friendship. When I am with you, I feel understood and valued in ways I have never experienced. Your support for my work means everything to me. but your personal attention has become equally important. Hearing her confession, Edmund felt relief mixed with renewed anxiety. The mutual attraction that had been building between them was now acknowledged openly, making it impossible to retreat to safer ground of mere friendship. However, Isabella continued, turning back to face him, I will not be the cause of destroying a relationship that has brought you stability and companionship. If you choose to remain with Lady Margaret, I will respect that decision and withdraw from your life as gracefully as possible. Edmund stood and moved closer to her, drawn by an irresistible impulse to eliminate the physical distance between them. Isabella, I need you to understand something. My feelings for you are not simply romantic infatuation or rebellion against long-standing obligations. You represent the person I want to become, someone who uses privilege for genuine service, who builds rather than merely preserves, who believes in transformation rather than accepting limitation. And Lady Margaret, what does she represent? Edmund considered the question carefully, knowing that his answer would reveal the true nature of his internal conflict. Margaret represents security, understanding, and the comfort of known quantities. She accepts my flaws and forgives my failures. With her, I know exactly what to expect from life. But that knowledge has become a form of imprisonment. Isabella stepped closer, and Edmund found himself looking down into eyes that seemed to hold infinite depth and possibility. Are you saying that you want to choose a future with me? She asked quietly. I am saying that I want to choose possibility over security, hope over resignation, and love that challenges me to become better rather than love that simply accepts what I am. The admission hung between them, representing Edmund's first clear articulation of his decision. As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt both liberation and terror at their implications. Isabella reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his palm. Then we must discuss practical matters. Such a choice will have consequences that extend far beyond our personal happiness. Edmund nodded, understanding that she was referencing the social, political, and financial ramifications of ending his relationship with Margaret to pursue someone younger and less established in society. I am prepared to face whatever consequences arise, he said, but I need to know that you are equally committed to navigating the difficulties ahead. Edmund, Isabella replied, her voice strong and certain, I have spent my entire adult life working for causes that require perseverance despite obstacles. If we choose to build a life together, I will bring that same dedication to our relationship. They stood together in the gathering dusk, hands joined and hearts committed to a path that would require courage, sacrifice, and unwavering mutual support. Edmund realized that his decision was made, though implementing it would require conversations and actions that would be among the most difficult of his life. There is one more thing, Isabella said as they prepared to part. Whatever happens between us, I want the educational project to continue. Those rural communities deserve better opportunities regardless of our personal situation. Edmund smiled, recognizing again the selfless perspective that had drawn him to her in the first place. The project will continue and expand. That much I can promise you. As he prepared to leave Fairfax Manor, Edmund knew that he was departing not just from a pleasant afternoon visit, but from the last moments of ambiguity in his life. Tomorrow would bring the difficult task of communicating his decision to Margaret, along with all the painful but necessary conversations that would follow. The carriage ride home passed in contemplation of endings and beginnings, of relationships that had served their purpose and new connections that promised transformation. Edmund felt the weight of impending change, but for the first time in months it was accompanied by hope rather than dread. Edmund's letter requesting Margaret's presence at Ravenshollow Castle was brief and formal, containing none of the warmth that had characterized their correspondence for 2 decades. He wrote only that urgent matters required immediate discussion and that he would await her at her earliest convenience. The carefully neutral tone conveyed more than elaborate explanations ever could. Margaret arrived within hours of receiving the message, her carriage moving through the autumn afternoon with the same urgency that had marked her previous visit. This time, however, Edmund sensed a different quality to her haste. Not the righteous anger of a woman fighting for her territory, but the desperate speed of someone rushing toward inevitable loss. She entered his study without ceremony, her traveling cloak still fastened and her face bearing the controlled expression of a woman steeling herself for battle. Edmund had positioned himself behind his desk, needing the formal barrier to maintain the resolve necessary for the conversation ahead. "Your summons was rather ominous," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from him with practiced grace despite the tension crackling in the air. "I assume this concerns our previous discussion about Lady Isabella Fairfax." "It does," Edmund replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "I have reached the decision you demanded, and I believe you deserve to hear it directly, rather than through correspondence or social gossip." Margaret's hands tightened slightly on the arms of her chair, but her expression remained carefully composed. "I appreciate your consideration for my dignity, though I suspect I will not appreciate the content of what you are about to say." Edmund had rehearsed this conversation countless times, searching for words that could convey his decision with honesty, while minimizing the inevitable pain. Now facing Margaret's controlled composure, he realized that no preparation could adequately address the complexity of ending a relationship that had shaped both their lives for 20 years. "Margaret, you have been the most important person in my life for longer than either of us probably care to calculate. What we have built together has sustained me through difficulties I could never have navigated alone. Your intelligence, your loyalty, and your understanding have been constants I could always depend upon." "Those sound remarkably like the opening words of a farewell speech," Margaret observed, her voice betraying the first hint of the emotion she was struggling to contain. "Because that is what they are," Edmund admitted, the words feeling like physical wounds as he spoke them. "I have decided to end our romantic relationship, to pursue the possibilities that have developed with Isabella." For several heartbeats, Margaret sat perfectly still, absorbing the finality of his declaration. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality of disbelief mixed with dawning recognition of reality. 20 years, Edmund. 20 years of shared experiences, mutual support, and genuine love. You are prepared to sacrifice all of that for an infatuation with a woman you have known for mere months? "It is not infatuation," Edmund replied, though he heard the defensive note in his own voice. "What I feel for Isabella represents the possibility of becoming the person I was meant to be, rather than simply accepting the person I have become." Margaret stood abruptly and moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames as though seeking answers in their shifting patterns. When she turned back to face him, her carefully maintained composure had cracked, revealing the raw pain beneath. "Do you understand what you are doing to me? I am 43 years old, Edmund. I have devoted the best years of my life to our relationship, turning down other offers and opportunities because I believed in what we were building together. Now you tell me it was all preliminary to finding someone younger and more inspiring." The accusation hit Edmund like a physical blow because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Margaret had indeed sacrificed other possibilities for their relationship, and her age made starting over far more challenging than it would be for a younger woman. "You are deliberately mischaracterizing both my decision and my motivations," he responded, standing to face her directly. "This is not about youth or novelty. It is about fundamental compatibility and shared vision for the future." "Shared vision," Margaret repeated bitterly. "And what vision did we share, Edmund? Was it insufficient that we understood each other's political perspectives, social obligations, and personal complexities? Was it meaningless that we could discuss any topic from philosophy to agriculture and find common ground? What we shared was intellectually stimulating and politically advantageous," Edmund acknowledged. "But it lacked the transformative power that I have discovered with Isabella. She challenges me to be better, to do more, to believe in possibilities rather than simply managing limitations." Margaret's laugh was sharp and painful to hear. "How convenient that you have discovered the need for transformation, just as an attractive young woman appeared to provide it. Tell me, Edmund, what happens when the novelty of your noble romance fades? What happens when Lady Isabella discovers that even idealistic projects require political maneuvering and practical compromises?" The question struck too close to Edmund's own occasional doubts for comfort. He had wondered whether his feelings for Isabella would survive the inevitable challenges of implementing their shared vision in a world that often resisted change. "I cannot predict the future," he said finally, "but I can acknowledge that remaining in our relationship while my heart is elsewhere would be unfair to both of us." "Unfair," Margaret said softly, moving closer to his desk. "Do you want to know what is truly unfair? Unfair is spending 20 years building something real and lasting, only to have it discarded because it no longer provides sufficient excitement. Unfair is being told that shared history and mutual understanding are inferior to romantic possibility. Edmund saw tears threatening in Margaret's eyes and felt his resolve wavering. The pain he was causing someone who had stood by him through countless difficulties seemed almost unbearable. Margaret, please understand that this decision brings me no joy. You have been my closest companion, my most trusted advisor, and my dearest friend. Losing you will create a void in my life that I am not certain can ever be filled. Then why are you making this choice? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. If you recognize what you are losing, why are you so willing to throw it away? Edmund searched for words that could adequately explain the fundamental shift that had occurred in his heart and mind since meeting Isabella. How could he describe the sense of renewed purpose, the excitement about future possibilities, and the feeling that he was finally becoming the person he was meant to be? Because I would rather regret taking a chance on love than regret never having tried, he said finally. What I feel for Isabella may prove to be temporary or misguided, but what I feel about our relationship is that it has become comfortable to the point of stagnation. Margaret absorbed this final blow with visible effort, her shoulders straightening as she gathered the dignity that had always been one of her most impressive qualities. Very well, Edmund. I understand your decision, though I believe you will come to regret it. I will not make this transition more difficult than necessary by clinging to what no longer serves us both. Her grace in defeat made Edmund's victory feel hollow and painful. He had expected anger, recriminations, and emotional manipulation. Instead, Margaret was offering him the gift of a clean break, maintaining her dignity while acknowledging his right to choose his own path. Hope that someday we might find a way to preserve some form of friendship, he said, quietly. Margaret gathered her cloak and moved toward the door, pausing only to deliver her final words on the matter. Friendship requires equality and mutual respect, Edmund. Right now, I can offer you neither. Perhaps time will change that, but today I can only wish you whatever happiness you believe you have chosen. After she left, Edmund remained in his study long into the evening, feeling the weight of irrevocable change settling around him like winter air. He had made his choice and accepted its consequences, but the cost was higher than he had anticipated. Tomorrow would bring the challenge of building something new with Isabella, but tonight belonged to mourning what had been lost. 6 months after his final conversation with Margaret, Edmund stood in the main classroom of the newly completed Moorfield Village School, watching Isabella work with a group of young students who were learning to measure and calculate crop yields using mathematical principles. The spring sunlight streaming through tall windows illuminated not just the cheerful space, but the transformation that had occurred in both the community and in Edmund's own life. The school represented more than educational innovation. It embodied the vision that had drawn Edmund and Isabella together and sustained them through the difficult period following his break with Margaret. The building itself was a testament to practical beauty, with spacious classrooms, a well-equipped library, and workshop areas where students could learn traditional crafts alongside modern techniques. Lord Blackwood, called young Thomas Henley, the same boy who had expressed interest in agricultural science during their first visit. Lady Isabella says you know about soil composition. Can you help us understand why different fields produce different crops? Edmund smiled, remembering when such questions would have been dismissed as unnecessary complexity for rural children. Under Isabella's guidance, the curriculum integrated practical knowledge with academic learning, creating engaged students who saw education as relevant to their daily lives rather than abstract obligation. Of course, Thomas. Let me show you something interesting about the soil samples we collected yesterday. As Edmund worked with the students, he was aware of Isabella's presence across the room, her patient explanations and encouraging manner, creating an atmosphere where learning flourished. Their partnership had evolved seamlessly from romantic attraction to practical collaboration, with each bringing complementary strengths to their shared mission. The first months following Margaret's departure had not been easy. Society's reaction to Edmund's choice had been swift and unforgiving. Several longtime political allies had distanced themselves, viewing his decision as evidence of unreliability or poor judgment. Social invitations had diminished, and he had noticed the whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when he entered rooms. Isabella had faced even harsher scrutiny, with many viewing her as an ambitious young woman who had deliberately targeted a wealthy nobleman for personal advancement. The accusations were painful precisely because they so completely misrepresented her genuine character and motivations. The gossips will find new scandals to discuss eventually. Isabella had assured him during one particularly difficult week, when 3 major social events had pointedly excluded them both. Our work will speak louder than their whispers. She had been correct. The success of the Moorfield School, followed by similar projects in 2 other villages, had begun to shift public opinion. Even critics had to acknowledge the positive impact of their educational initiatives, and several prominent families had quietly inquired about implementing similar programs on their own estates. Margaret, for her part, had maintained dignified silence about the end of their relationship. She had left for an extended tour of the continent immediately after their final conversation, and upon her return had established herself as hostess to a prominent political salon that rivaled any in the capital. Society had embraced her transformation from abandoned woman to independent intellectual, and her influence in political circles had arguably increased rather than diminished. Edmund had seen her briefly at a parliamentary reception 3 months earlier. They had exchanged polite greetings and brief conversation about mutual acquaintances, but the easy intimacy of their former relationship was gone forever. Margaret appeared poised and confident, yet Edmund had noticed a coolness in her manner that suggested forgiveness remained distant. "The children are making remarkable progress," Isabella said, joining Edmund as the afternoon session concluded and students began departing for their homes. "Thomas has mastered concepts that many university students struggle with. You have created something extraordinary here," Edmund replied, gesturing toward the now empty classroom where evidence of serious learning filled every corner. "This is exactly what you envisioned during our first conversation about rural education." Isabella moved closer to him, and Edmund felt the familiar warmth that her presence always brought. Their relationship had deepened steadily as they worked together, facing challenges that had tested both their commitment to each other and their shared goals. "We have created something extraordinary," she corrected gently. "None of this would have been possible without your support and resources." Edmund took her hand, noting how natural the gesture had become after months of partnership in both work and love. "I believe we make an effective team, Lady Isabella." "Indeed we do, Lord Edmund, though I suspect our effectiveness extends beyond educational projects." Their informal engagement had been announced quietly the previous month, with wedding plans proceeding deliberately to allow society time to adjust to their union. The ceremony would be modest by aristocratic standards, reflecting their preference for substance over display. As they walked through the village toward their waiting carriage, Edmund reflected on the changes that had transformed his life. The excitement and uncertainty he had felt during those first conversations with Isabella had evolved into steady confidence in their future together. Their relationship was built on shared values, mutual respect, and genuine compatibility that had only strengthened under pressure. "I received a letter from Lord Hertford yesterday," Edmund mentioned as they settled into the carriage for the ride back to Ravenshollow Castle. "He is requesting advice about establishing a similar school on his Somerset estate." "That would be the 4th inquiry this month," Isabella noted with satisfaction. "Perhaps we should consider writing a handbook for other families interested in rural education initiatives." Edmund smiled at her immediate leap from personal success to broader impact. This tendency to think beyond their immediate circumstances was one of the qualities that had drawn him to Isabella and continued to inspire him daily. "An excellent idea. We could document not just the practical aspects but the social benefits we have observed." The carriage rolled through countryside that was beginning to show signs of spring renewal. Edmund found himself anticipating the summer months when their wedding would take place, and their collaboration would become a formal union. The challenges they had faced had prepared them for the realities of building a life together, and he felt confident in their ability to navigate whatever difficulties lay ahead. "Edmund," Isabella said quietly as Ravenshollow Castle came into view, "do you ever regret the choices you made to be with me?" The question was one they had discussed before, but Edmund understood her need for reassurance given the sacrifices their relationship had required. "I regret the pain that my choices caused Margaret," he replied honestly, "but I have never regretted choosing love over comfort, possibility over security, or transformation over stagnation. What we have built together justifies every difficulty we have faced." Isabella nodded, her expression mixing relief with renewed determination. Then we must continue building both our relationship and our work. There are so many communities that could benefit from what we have learned. As their carriage pulled up to the castle entrance, Edmund felt profound gratitude for the series of decisions that had led him to this moment. The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities, challenges, and opportunities to create meaningful change. Most importantly, he would face that future with a partner who shared his vision and complemented his strengths. Margaret had retreated into the shadows of his past, taking with her the comfort of familiar routines and predictable outcomes. In her place, Isabella had brought light, hope, and the exhilarating uncertainty of a life dedicated to growth rather than mere preservation. Edmund's heart had indeed turned toward Kate while Camilla receded into darkness, but the transformation had brought illumination rather than loss, possibility rather than regret. The educational initiative that had brought them together continued to expand, touching more lives and creating ripples of positive change throughout the region. Their personal happiness was inextricably linked to their shared purpose, creating a foundation for marriage that promised to be both emotionally satisfying and socially beneficial. As they entered Raven's Hollow Castle together, Edmund and Isabella carried with them the satisfaction of having chosen love, courage and hope over security, comfort and resignation. The future awaited, bright with promise and rich with possibility,